A fellow came by the orchard a couple springs back, proud as anything, having spent his whole Saturday out with loppers and a pruning saw tidying up a young apple tree that had gotten a bit wild over the year before. Nice clean cuts, well made and properly angled. Genuinely good instincts too, honestly, about which branches actually needed opening up and which ones were fine left alone. Wrong month entirely, by roughly about 10 full weeks, and it genuinely cost him the entire season's crop on that particular tree, plus a fire blight infection that took 2 more full years to fully clear up completely. He'd done everything right except the timing, and the timing is the one thing that mattered most. Good sharp tools, careful precise angles, the right instinct about which branches were crossing and which ones needed opening up. All of that craft, undone by picking the wrong 10 weeks on the calendar to actually do it. I want to spend today on that timing specifically, because in 50 years of doing this work, and teaching a fair number of people to do it themselves, the actual cutting technique has never once been the thing that cost somebody a season. The calendar has, more times than I could count. I've been working this particular orchard, and the one my own father worked here before me, for the better part of 50 years now, through more springs and winters than I can properly count anymore, and if there's one piece of advice I find myself repeating more than any other, it's this. Late winter, well before the buds ever start to break open. Not spring, however tempting spring genuinely is. Spring pruning is one of the most common mistakes I see, and it's rarely because somebody doesn't know how to make a cut. It's because nobody ever explained why the calendar matters as much as the technique. Here's the plain version of why. A tree spends the tail end of every summer and all of autumn storing energy down in the roots and trunk, getting ready for the following year's growth. Through winter, that tree is essentially dormant, resting on those reserves. The moment the bud starts swelling and breaking in spring, the tree switches hard into active growth mode, pulling stored energy up and out into new leaves, new shoots, and the blossoms that would have become your fruit. Cut into the tree during that specific narrow window, and you are removing living tissue at precisely the moment the tree has committed the most stored energy into pushing it forward. The tree cannot tell the difference between you and a storm breaking a limb. It simply reads a sudden loss and reacts accordingly, whatever the actual cause happened to be. It is a completely different injury than the exact same cut, in the exact same spot, made back in January instead. The tree itself, the branch, the saw in your hand, every bit of it identical in both scenarios. Only the calendar has genuinely changed, and that single difference changes almost everything about how the tree responds afterward. Let me walk you through what that actually costs, because it's more than people expect. The first cost is the fruit itself, and it's the most obvious one. Spring pruning very often removes flower buds and blossom clusters that have already formed and are just about to open. Every one of those you cut away is fruit that simply will not happen this year on that branch. I've watched people prune a mature, healthy tree in April and then wonder in July why the harvest was thin, never connecting the two, because the pruning happened months before the disappointment did, and by July, there's nothing left connecting the two events in most people's minds at all. The second cost is sap loss, what old-timers around here still call bleeding, though it's really just the tree's sugary sap running freely from a fresh wound. Cut a tree in the dead of winter, and there's very little sap movement to speak of. Cut the same tree once the sap is rising in spring, and you'll often see it run for days, sometimes visibly dripping. That's the tree's stored energy leaking out through a fresh cut at the exact time it can least afford to lose any of it, on top of whatever flower buds you may have already removed in the same session. I've seen a young tree, cut carelessly in spring, lose enough sap that the branch below the cut visibly wilted within a week, purely from the loss of pressure and sugar it needed to support that new spring growth. That is not a small cosmetic issue. That is a genuine setback to a tree still establishing itself. The third cost, and the one that worries me most as an orchardist, is disease. Fresh pruning wounds made in spring are essentially an open door for infection, and that door stays open considerably longer in warm, humid spring weather than it ever does in the cold, dry air typical of a properly timed dormant pruning window. Fire blight in particular, which affects apples and pears especially hard, spreads through exactly this kind of fresh wound during exactly this kind of weather. I've lost entire limbs, and in one bad year very nearly lost a whole tree, to infections that started at a pruning cut, made at the wrong time of year. A cut made back in January simply doesn't have that same open door sitting there through the warm, wet weeks when the bacteria responsible for fire blight are at their most active. By the time real spring weather arrives, a properly timed winter cut has already had months to callus over and close on its own, long before the conditions that actually spread infection ever show up. Apples and pears carry the highest risk here specifically, and if you're growing either of those, this single reason alone is worth building your entire pruning schedule around. I've watched fire blight move through a young orchard block in a single wet spring, entering almost exclusively through cuts made that same season, and the trees that had been pruned properly back in the dead of winter came through that same wet spring completely unaffected, standing right next to the ones that hadn't. Fourth cost is what happens to the growth that follows. A tree pruned in spring, right as it's surging into its most vigorous growth phase, often responds by throwing up a thicket of soft, upright water sprouts, essentially the tree panicking and trying to replace what it lost as fast as it possibly can. Those sprouts rarely produce fruit themselves. They crowd the center of the tree and block light and air from reaching the branches that do, and you end up needing to go back in and remove much of that new growth again the following winter. Anyway, you've done the work twice, spent twice the time out there with your tools, for a genuinely worse result than if you'd simply waited 2 months and done it once correctly the first time. I think of it a bit like waking someone suddenly from a deep sleep and asking them to sprint. The body responds, but not calmly, not efficiently, and not in a way that produces anything useful. A tree cut hard in spring reacts the same way, throwing energy at fast, soft, poorly attached growth instead of the steady, well-structured branching you actually want. Those water sprouts grow fast, specifically because they're a panic response, not a plan, and fast growth in a fruit tree is very rarely the kind of growth you actually want more of. And the fifth cost, the quiet one nobody talks about, is what it does to the tree's overall vigor heading into the following year. A tree that loses stored energy to bleeding, loses developing fruit, and then spends its summer regrowing water sprouts instead of properly filling out its permanent framework, goes into the next winter in a genuinely weaker position than it would have otherwise. One badly timed spring pruning rarely kills a healthy, established tree outright, but a pattern of it, year after year, absolutely wears one down. And I've seen orchards where that slow decline gets blamed on the soil or the weather or bad luck, when the actual cause has been standing at the base of the tree. With pruning shears every April for a decade, it is a genuinely hard cause to trace back, because none of the individual years look dramatic on their own. It is only when you step back and look at 5 or 10 years together that the pattern becomes obvious, and by then, a tree that could have been thriving is instead simply surviving, year after year, on less vigor than it started with. So when should you actually be doing this? Late winter, once the coldest part of the season has passed, but well before any buds have started to swell or show color, is the ideal general window for most fruit trees in a temperate climate. You're looking for a stretch of dry, cold weather with the tree still fully dormant. In practice, for most home growers, that lands somewhere in the back half of winter, moving into the very earliest weeks of what still genuinely feels like proper cold weather, well before the very first hint of green appears anywhere on the tips of the branches you're looking at. There is one real exception worth knowing, and I don't want to oversimplify this into a blanket rule that misleads you. Light summer pruning, done specifically to manage size and shape on a tree that's grown too vigorous, is a genuinely different technique, carried out for a genuinely different reason entirely, and it absolutely has its place on certain trees within certain growing systems, once you already understand the fundamentals I'm covering today. What I'm talking about today is the heavy structural pruning most home orchardists do once a year, the real shaping cuts, and that kind of pruning belongs in the dormant season. Full stop. Not in spring, regardless of how good the weather happens to look that particular weekend. If you're growing stone fruit specifically, peaches, plums, cherries, and their relatives, there's a further wrinkle worth knowing. Many of these are actually more susceptible to a different set of fungal diseases when pruned during the coldest, wettest part of true winter, and a number of experienced growers deliberately push their pruning window later, closer to when the buds are just starting to swell but haven't yet broken, rather than the depths of winter that works well for apples and pears. This is exactly the kind of species-specific detail that a general rule can't fully capture, and it's worth checking what's recommended for your specific type of tree, rather than assuming every fruit tree follows an identical calendar. A few things worth doing before you pick up a pruning saw again. Look closely at your buds before you cut anything at all, on more than one branch and more than one part of the tree, since buds nearer the top and on the sunnier side often swell earlier than buds lower down or on a shaded side. If you can see any swelling, any hint of green starting to show at the tip anywhere on the tree, you have already missed the ideal window for that season, and you're better off waiting until the tree goes properly dormant again the following year, or limiting yourself to only the most minor, essential corrective cuts rather than a full structural prune this time around. Check the weather forecast for the days immediately following any pruning you do plan to carry out. A dry, cold stretch afterward genuinely matters because it gives any cut a real chance to callus over cleanly before disease pressure has any real opportunity to take hold in that fresh injury. Clean your tools between trees and ideally between cuts on a tree you already suspect might be carrying disease. A simple wipe with rubbing alcohol takes seconds and prevents you from being the one who carries an infection from one tree to the next on the blade itself, which happens more often than most home growers realize, particularly when working through several trees in a single afternoon. Make your cuts properly regardless of timing, close to the branch collar, rather than flush against the trunk, and not leaving a stub behind either. Good technique and good timing work together, and neither one fully compensates for getting the other wrong. A perfectly timed cut, made carelessly, still leaves a ragged injury more likely to invite trouble, the same as a beautifully made cut at exactly the wrong time of year. And if you've already gone out and made this exact mistake earlier this year, do not panic, and please do not try to overcorrect with more cutting in an effort to somehow fix it right away. Leave the tree alone for the rest of this season. Let it recover and rebuild its reserves in peace, and simply plan to prune properly, at the right time, the following winter instead. One badly timed year is rarely the end of a tree's story, provided you don't compound the original mistake with more badly timed cuts trying to hurry a fix that the tree genuinely doesn't need from you right now. Trees are remarkably forgiving of a single bad year, far more forgiving than most people give them credit for, and the worst thing you can do after one poorly timed prune is panic and prune again out of season trying to correct it. I want to say plainly, because I think it matters, that nobody who prunes in spring is doing anything wrong out of carelessness. Spring is when the weather finally turns genuinely pleasant, when the garden calls you outside after a long grey winter spent mostly indoors, and when a tree that has looked a bit unruly all season finally catches your eye. Properly, right at the moment you actually have the time and inclination to do something about it. The impulse makes complete sense. It's simply the one time of year that costs the tree the most for exactly the same cut that would have cost it almost nothing 2 months earlier. I've put together a proper written guide covering the full pruning calendar for the trees most people actually grow at home, species by species, rather than one blanket rule, along with clear, simple photographs of what dormant buds look like set directly against buds that have already started to swell, so you're never left guessing which side of that window you're actually standing on. It also walks through proper cutting technique itself, since good timing paired with a careless cut still leaves you with a worse outcome than either problem on its own. It's linked below, and it exists because 50 years of watching people make this exact same well-meaning mistake has taught me that a clear calendar and a couple of good photographs solve this far more reliably than any amount of general advice on its own ever could. I'll say one more thing before I let you go, because I think it's the part that actually sticks. Patience is the entire skill here, more than the pruning itself. Waiting those extra 2 months, watching the tree through the last stretch of winter, rather than acting the moment the weather turns pleasant, is a genuinely hard thing to do when you're eager to get out there and tidy something up. But an orchard rewards patience more reliably than almost anything else I know, and this is one of the clearest examples of that I can offer you. If you take one thing from today, go and look closely at your trees before you touch them with a blade again. If there's any green showing at all, put the tools away until next winter, and your trees and your harvest will genuinely thank you for the patience